From the gateway to the west, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Noory. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, communicating with the divine. Here's what's happening. Sad story out of Louisville, Kentucky. The Louisville Metropolitan Police say 5 people are dead, including the gunman, 8 others injured in the Kentucky city following a shooting at a building that houses an old National Bank location. The lone shooter in the incident, identified by police as someone who did have a connection to the bank location, he worked there, is deceased as well. Jeez. Taiwan is sounding alarms over Chinese military drills that it says could mistakenly spark an uncontrollable war that would draw in countries from around the world. The comments came as large-scale Chinese military drills entered their 3rd day, with the Chinese military declaring that it's ready to fight if Taiwan were to attempt to declare its independence from the mainland, which they apparently have already done. Banning TikTok has been a hot topic in Congress lately, but if lawmakers go through with a ban on the social network owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, the U.S. could end up banning or restricting access to many more apps and technology products than just TikTok. What a precedent this would set. Lauren Weinstein, our expert on such matters, is with us. Lauren, what's going to go on with this?
Yeah, this is all about a lot more than TikTok. We're increasingly seeing that political threats to the Internet around the world are triggered often by unwarranted hysteria and increasingly bipartisan in nature attacks. Both parties buying into concepts that frankly could result in making us more and more like the way China restricts their Internet with massive government control. We've seen this now here in the U.S. with conflicting state laws about Internet content and bipartisan moves that could actually result in everyone ultimately having to be identified by their government IDs for accessing any websites that have content considered by someone somewhere to be, quote, inappropriate for children, unquote. And now we have the proposed bipartisan Restrict Act, which would give the federal government, whichever party happens to be in control at any given time, apparently the ability to restrict access to sites that the government deems a risk, with few protections for overreach. Now, we all know that this bill has been inspired by hysteria over TikTok, which is, again, ironic when those proposed restrictions seem to be so much in line with communist Chinese restrictions on their own people's use of the net. And most technical observers now feel that TikTok isn't likely doing anything that a wide variety of 100% U.S. apps are legally doing. And if China really wanted more data, they wouldn't need to use these apps to steal it. They could just buy data on the open market. There's also a lot of concern now that the Restrict Act is written. It's so broad, and again, remember, major bipartisan support in Congress, right, that it might even outlaw much usage of VPNs, which many people use due to privacy and security concerns, because VPNs could technically be used to circumvent the restrictions of the Act. In China, by the way, you can get in an enormous amount of trouble using VPNs, and now we have both parties here seeming to be pushing for legislation that could be taking us down the same path. The Act may also prohibit side-loading unapproved apps into your computer or phone. Now, as always, when looking at legislation like this, we need to ask ourselves not only what the government officials currently in power would do with it, but what future officials will do with that kind of power, perhaps officials from the other party. And often the most reasonable analysis is that you really don't want to be giving these kinds of Internet control powers to officials in either party. And we know from history that once you give that kind of power, it can be very, very difficult to ever take it back when things go wrong. We need to start learning from history. And Lauren, the country of Australia is banning TikTok on government computers. Yeah, I mean, this is going on. This hysteria over TikTok is viral, basically. And yet, when you get down into the nitty-gritty of the technical aspects, TikTok isn't much different than most other apps out there, and we don't really know what most apps are doing with our data. So really what's happening now is it's China, so they're concentrating on China. The thing of it is that by putting all this effort into worrying about apps from China, we're taking our eyes off the ball about all the things going on with other apps that are doing very much the same thing and could be perhaps even more dangerous to our privacy. So it's not a very wise way to be looking at it overall. Good point. Thanks, Lauren. We'll talk to you next week.
Americans are bracing for higher inflation over the next few years, even as they worry about a potential credit crunch following a spate of bank failures, according to a key Federal Reserve Bank of New York survey. The median expectation is that the inflation rate will be up 4.7% 1 year from now, according to the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations, up from 4.2% in February. Dr. Sky looks at the skies for us. Let's see what Stephen Cates has for us this week. Hi, Stephen. Welcome to the program.
Hello, George. Once again, yes, George, get set for a new mission to Jupiter's main moons. We know them as Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, all discovered by Galileo back in 1610. What are we talking about? It's the European Space Agency's JUICE mission, short for Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer. And it's set for an 11-year mission just to get to Jupiter. But here it is, with a launch window this Wednesday from the ESA's spaceport in French Guiana on the powerful Ariane 5 rocket. That's the same powerful rocket which launched the James Webb Telescope back on December 25th in 2021. But the spacecraft will search for possible life from potential subterranean lakes and oceans. Like that, we may be, of course, under the satellite known as Europa. But there's a problem. At the distance Europa orbits from Jupiter, the harsh radiation from Jupiter will harm the electronics possibly on the spacecraft. So this spacecraft, JUICE, will only make a few past observations of the satellite Europa. The main target for JUICE will be the largest moon in the solar system, known as Ganymede, which is actually larger, George, than the planet Mercury. And it's also the only moon in the solar system to have its own magnetic field. So in 2034, the spacecraft will look to orbit Ganymede, the first spacecraft to orbit a major moon in the solar system. Some real exciting science is just ahead. The James Webb Telescope images the seventh planet, Uranus. Uranus was discovered back in 1781 by the astronomer William Herschel. It's about 4 times the size of the Earth, super cold, and it's now, get a load of this, 1,910,000,000 miles away from the Earth. If you could jump on a light beam, it would take you 2 hours and 50 minutes just to get to Uranus. The James Webb Telescope shows us amazing views with its 13 rings made up of ice and dust. Uranus, as a planet, is tipped 90 degrees on its side and orbits the sun once in every 84-year period. It's spring in the northern hemisphere of Uranus, with summer to begin in the year 2028. But finally, it has an amazing array of 27 moons. But closer to home, a new large sunspot group is emerging from the sun's southeastern limb, and it's already hurling an M2-class solar flare our way, causing a brief shortwave blackout over Australia and the Indian Ocean. We'll be watching this expanding sunspot group as solar cycle 25 is obviously getting much stronger. We're wrapping up with the live sky. The moon fades to last quarter on the 13th, but the planet Venus, now 104 million miles from the Earth, passes the beautiful star cluster called the Pleiades. How do you see it? Just over the next few evenings, if you look a few degrees to the right of Venus, you'll see the beautiful star cluster in the west at sunset. Mercury also makes a good appearance, some 20 degrees away from the sun, below that of the planet Venus. For more information, always theskylive.com, and emails. We love those, drsky@gmail.com. What do we say, George? We always mean it. Always remember to keep your eyes to the skies, as simply, I'm your navigator and the show's on the highway to the heavens. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sky. Look forward to talking to you next week. Up next, 2 special guests join us for the next couple hours. Up first is Jeffrey Stegman, and we will be talking with Jeffrey about his work with Focused Life Force Energy. Then later on this hour, Dr. Gary Schwartz join us. Both of them will stay next hour for calls with you on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. 2 special guests with us for this hour, and both will stay with us for calls next hour. Up first is Jeffrey Stegman, co-founder of Focus Life Force Energy with Clayton Stegman, based in Canada, offering an international high-consciousness field service. Jeffrey and Clayton's research on consciousness fields sheds light on little-known influences that are greatly affecting all of us. Jeffrey and Clayton provide tools and teach how to use high consciousness fields for personal evolution and to create a personal sanctuary. Jeffrey, welcome to the program.
Thank you, George. Glad to be here.
Tell me how you got involved in the special life force technology and energy.
Well, I was working with a young man who had cancer, by the way, brain stem cancer.
Oh, geez.
And his his parents had found me somehow, and I was doing a certain kind of meditation with him. And my friend Clayton Stegman told me, well, he had the same type of cancer. And he said, come with me up to Canada, and I'll show you this machine, this incredible machine. So we went to this tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, and there was this, looked like a Nikola Tesla, setup. It was high-speed alternating current. There were plates and coils up and down through this room. And when you walked in, it was like a high-consciousness bath. I mean, my hair was like standing up, George. It was such an intense energy. And what we learned to use that technology, this really a consciousness machine or consciousness technology, to activate consciousness fields, high consciousness fields. And, Clayton was able to clear what was going on in his health, and it's a long story with the other boy, but, we really focused in on consciousness fields to support our evolution, health, well-being, create that a sanctuary space. And we stayed away from the health side of it because, the United States, that can be an issue.
Yeah, that's right.
Instead, we wanted to give people that pristine, high consciousness space in their home and around their cell phone, and that's how we developed FLFE over time.
What does high consciousness mean to you, Jeff?
Well, it means to us that it's much higher than the surrounding area, and than what you might normally find. So when we're walking around every day, we're surrounded by consciousness fields and thought forms. It's just everywhere we go. Some might be ancient battles, torture, death. Trauma tends to create low consciousness fields, which could explain some of the paranormal. And then there's high consciousness fields in places like, worship, where there's, positive, love-based worship over many years. And sometimes it's like Earth locations that have crossing of grids that create a high consciousness zone. And, the Catholic Church built a lot of churches on top of those kind of places to create high consciousness fields. So high consciousness is unusual. You will find them maybe a half dozen places in the world where they're really high.
Can you use this ability to calm down the consciousness of the chaos that is out there on the planet today?
Yeah, that's right. We hear over and over from our customers, this is a subscription service, FLFE, that they don't want to leave their homes. It feels so good to be in the home because it's calm. The consciousness field, when it's higher like that, just supports us to personally rise in consciousness. There's more light, there's more energy there. We have more energy, for our everyday life. But there's also that sort of love zone where, meditations are easier, communication is easier, and it's just an antidote for the chaos that's really out there, which is partially, I think, consciousness fields, global, local, affecting us, and a high consciousness field seems to be an antidote somehow for that.
Jeff, what is low consciousness?
Well, George, that would be trauma. That would be the lower emotions, fear, anger, despair. Like if you went to an old prison, even if it's no longer a prison, those low consciousness fields of that sort of despair and maybe anger will remain in the crystalline structure of the concrete floor and the concrete blocks,
like in the walls everywhere.
Yeah, and it stays there almost indefinitely. I mean, we've run across ancient, native wars, battles between tribes that caused, torture in low consciousness zones that remain, affecting people in their homes. And they don't even realize it. They just feel bad. They might feel depressed, and they don't realize that there's another factor in these thought forms and these consciousness fields that are affecting them.
Jeff, give us an example of this high consciousness versus low consciousness, if you can.
Well, it's interesting. Both a birth of a child, say in a good situation, everybody's healthy in a hospital or even a home environment, that activates a high consciousness field, and that's a real life experience, sometimes a once in a lifetime experience for people. And deaths. When you talk to someone that's been, helping people pass over a hospice location or a hospice worker that goes to people's homes, that moment of death is another high consciousness field that opens. Other ones can be, as I said, a cathedral or a place of worship. Many of the cathedrals in Europe have very high consciousness fields. Alma the Hugging Saint, I don't know if you've ever been to see her.
No, I have not.
It's like a high consciousness field as you walk in closer and closer to see her. It's very uplifting, very heart-opening, and it really helps you be a better person.
What creates the high consciousness, Jeff? Do human beings do this? Do we do this on our own, or is it God-given to us? How does it come?
I agree. I think you're right. It's a God-given human ability. I think we're incredibly powerful as humans, and the two are more gathered, in the Bible, I think is acknowledging that when people get together, they can create high fields if they have a positive intent and they're doing something positive for the world. And we create those fields. We do it in our research department for FLFE, and it's amazing what happens in a high consciousness field. There's less mind chatter, the mind quiets, and more access to knowledge, to, whether it's a higher power or a higher consciousness, ideas come through, ideas happen and problems get solved.
How do you teach someone to raise their consciousness level?
Well, there's, so FLFE activates a high consciousness field. So being in a high consciousness field, whether it's that or you go to a pilgrimage site somewhere, or you just create a space in your house where you meditate every day in the same place. It creates a zone there that becomes high consciousness over time, especially if it's two or more people meditating together or praying together. So in those high consciousness environments, those lower vibrating parts of us tend to rise and clear from us. So we encourage people to pay attention to what's coming up, what emotions or feelings, thought forms are coming up, old patterns from our parents, and just love them and kiss them goodbye. I mean, just let them, first of all, feel, and then in a high consciousness field, things tend to dissipate.
Since you've been doing this, and it's been a number of years, what have you found to be one of the most remarkable things you've gone through, Jeff?
Yeah, I think for me, what really gets me, George, is when there's major shifts in people's lives. Like I had a sister tell us that her brother was paralyzed in a terrible car accident and was so depressed that he didn't leave his bed for months. And she put on a high consciousness field. She happened to be FLFE. And she came home that day and he was in his wheelchair outside. that he found the energy, found the will to live, and in those higher vibrations, he transcended the depression he had.
Amazing. Jeff, we're going to bring in Dr. Gary Schwartz in a moment and bring you back for phone calls with Gary next hour on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. We're back now with Dr. Gary Schwartz, professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery. He's the director of the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. After receiving his doctorate from Harvard University, he served as a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Yale University, director of the Yale Psychophysics Center, and the co-director of the Yale Behavioral Medicine Center. Dr. Schwartz has published more than 500 scientific papers, edited 14 academic books, and is the author of 11 books, including The Afterlife. He's got a new one coming out, and here he is back on Coast to Coast. Hello, Gary. Welcome back, my friend.
Hi, George. It's lovely to be here with you again.
It's great. And I remember going to an event that you were speaking at, and it was just riveting. I mean, you do a great job. How'd you get involved in all of this study kind of work, Gary?
All of this kind of work? You mean all the extraordinary claims?
All of them.
Wow. If I were to have to pick one thing, I would say, quote, curiosity. I think that one of my former students at Yale did his PhD with me. He said, Gary, he said, you know what one of your biggest problems is? And I said, I'm not sure because I have so many of them. And he said, your biggest problem is you have an overdeveloped sense of wonder. And what he meant by that is that I really find life fascinating. And I am drawn to seeking truths, trying to understand nature and the universe. And circumstances kept, if you would, being brought to me, which raised amazing questions. And my curiosity, in part, drove me to follow these things up. And whether it was addressing the question of life after death, or energy healing, or communicating with divinity and the source, or whatever, it was very often circumstances that came into my life and triggered my curiosity and a desire to know, is it real?
For as long as I can remember, Gary, you've always been interested in the mind-body medicine tie-in, haven't you?
Correct. In fact, it's amusing, George, that most people have difficulty pronouncing the phrase psychophysiology, like the Center for the Yale Psychophysiology Center.
Right.
When I was at Yale, and you called it this. I can't even remember how you pronounced it. The psychophysical or something like that. It was really cute, and so I'm glad this was recorded because I want to get the exact pronunciation.
Now you have a new book coming out called the FLFE experiments. Tell me about that.
Yes, this is the fourth book in the experiments series. The first three were the afterlife experiments, and then the God experiments and the energy healing experiments. And I really wasn't anticipating writing another experiments book, although we've been talking about completing one called the Soul Phone experiments. But what happened was that when I was introduced to the FLFE hypothesis, the focused life force energy hypothesis, actually through a colleague of mine in the Office of Technology Transfer at the University of Arizona. And I was intrigued with not only their experiences and their claims, but the fact that the founders and the principals seemed so caring about trying to help humanity, and they were very evidence-based. I decided that I would consider consulting for them and approaching it with an open mind and an open heart, but drawing no conclusions, not making any decisions one way or another about whether it was, quote, real or not. And over a 2-year period, I had the privilege to conduct a series of experiments as part of their research team, and I was led to the conclusion that it was real and then some. And then on top of that, I had a personal experience, which I actually confess for the first time in the book, when I inadvertently started to be on the service, which is a very amusing story. And both my wife, Rhonda, and I spontaneously had experiences which were novel, and mine dramatically improved the quality of my life. And we became convinced that this information needed to be shared, both with the public and with the scientific community, and with educators and students. And so I began the process now of writing this book.
Good for you. Is this higher consciousness brain related, or is it coming from some other area?
That is a great question. When I look at the totality of the data that have been collected, plus our current understanding of the relationship between mind and brain, I have been sort of forced to start seriously accepting the idea that what's primary in the universe is actually consciousness, mind and consciousness, which, as you know, is a very old idea.
Sure.
And that what we call energy and information, and finally the creation of what we experience as the material world, that's all secondary to a universal consciousness phenomena. And therefore, ultimately, any kind of theory that we have or level of explanation, particularly for the things that don't fit within the mainstream materialist paradigm, requires that we, if you would think outside the box and take what some of us now call a post-materialist perspective. And the idea, therefore, that we need to think about consciousness in a broader way actually helps us better understand anomalies, be they in life after death or in higher spiritual beings, or we call UFO phenomena, and a host of other phenomena, including healing.
What does higher consciousness mean to you, Gary?
I think the important qualifier you said was mean to me. So I'll give you my personal interpretation of this, as opposed to, for example, the framework that FLFE proposes, which is a very good one, or one of the originators of measuring levels of consciousness, which was Dr. David Hawkins. When I think of higher consciousness or levels of consciousness, it has to do with the capacity to think ever wider and ever deeper, and be able to both integrate and extend one's awareness. And what happens when you do that, and in the extreme case, for example, is the experience of oneness as an expression of that with this increased level of conscious awareness, conscious experience, not only does one have increased understanding, but one also has the capacity to better understand ethics, morality, motivation for seeking the best and highest good, ideally for all of creation. These higher values tend to co-occur with this expanded notion of consciousness. And by the way, in relationship to things like higher consciousness and high consciousness fields is the notion of enlightenment, which, as you know, literally comes to mean to enlighten, to bear light on, and therefore to be able to see. And that with increased levels of enlightenment, there's increased levels of compassion, understanding, and so on.
It is truly remarkable. If somebody puts themselves, Doctor, in a higher consciousness state, what happens?
Again, that's a really fascinating question, because higher states of consciousness can be promoted through various, there are many routes and methods to enhance one's levels of consciousness, including being in the presence of other individuals who are seeking such consciousness. Lynn McTaggart, who I know you've had on your show multiple times, and she wrote a book called The Power of Eight, when groups of 6 to 8 people come together and they, for example, pray together or have higher intentions together. You get an amplification effect, a mutual effect of coherence, and with the intention of seeking a higher consciousness state, one can have multiple experiences. There are changes in brainwave activity, although more of this has been observed, for example, in higher meditation states. This is yet to be formally now applied to groups of people who are engaged in high consciousness states, but the technology is now possible to do that. And what's also interesting is that people often experience joy and peace and increased love and excitement and wonder and awe. It's a very place to be in your mind.
It is remarkable. How many people, and I'm not talking about the medical folks or scientists, but how many of the average folks out there, Gary, understand what consciousness is all about? I mean, you're doing a great job educating people, but how many people really know?
First of all, I don't think anyone really knows. But in terms of people's both depth and breadth of understanding of consciousness, people vary in that. I mean, as you know, there were scholars like William James, for example, who was a hero of mine, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, who was both a physician and a philosopher who was at Harvard. And he wrote a book, for example, called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he really looked at how people experience higher consciousness states. And what you find is that there are certain commonalities that people have, but very often it's filtered through our cultural upbringing and the language that we have and so on. And I would say that the average person has relatively little insight about the breadth and depth of particularly what the conscious human mind can do. That one of the exercises that I do, that when I teach students about a hypothesis, which I can easily demonstrate, which is the mind is actually bigger than the entire universe. You're probably aware that Einstein said imagination was more important than knowledge, and he was certainly a hero.
That's right.
Mine, many other people. Is that if I ask a person, for example, and you can think about this, and your listeners can try this themselves. If we look at our hands, for example, we could imagine, let's say, holding a photon. And then we could think about what it might look like and what it might feel like. And then we could imagine holding, for example, a whole atom, let's say, of hydrogen, which of course is much bigger and has mass compared to a photon. We could imagine it. And then we could imagine, for example, holding a whole cell in our hand. Or we could imagine holding an organ in our hand. Or we could imagine holding a person in our hand. Or we can imagine holding a planet in our hand, or holding a galaxy in our hand. And if we keep this process going, in each case, you can think about what it might look like, what it might feel like, what its colors might be, how would you measure it. And then what you could do is you could say, okay, imagine that you stepped outside the entire universe, and you're holding the entire universe in your hand. What do you think that looks like? And then you can go even one step further. You can say, okay, can you now imagine that you the person in your body, is standing in your hand? Can you imagine yourself in your hand, and you're looking down at yourself, imagining something greater than the entire universe? What you can see is that our minds can jump from the abstract and the ultra tiny to the extraordinary superclusters of galaxies and the cosmic web, and even multiverses as a hypothesis. All that more is capable within the human mind. And the question is, where does all that capability come from? And that's one of the reasons that we realize that our potential is actually much greater than we have been, most of us currently recognize.
Can you notice, Gary, when you meet someone, if they get it with terms of higher consciousness as opposed to somebody who doesn't have it?
That is a fantastic question, George, if I might say. No one's ever asked me that question before. But I think if I reflected upon it, I would have to say the answer is actually yes. And I probably could come up with a set of questions that I could ask a person. And based on their responses and how they pondered and answered these questions, we could predict what their level of consciousness is.
Right, it's truly remarkable to be able to do that. And one day, if you're able to tap into it, there may be some amazing things you may be able to do with all this.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I'm so excited about FLFE about. And I hope at least some of your listeners might be enticed to, inspired to go to their website and consider signing up for a free trial. And they don't have to give a credit card or anything. And the reason is because the kinds of experiences that people spontaneously report, for example, on their Facebook pages, or now in the research that we've gathered, when you look at the totality of those experiences, you recognize that there's something that's much greater and deeper than virtually anything that I've witnessed in all of my years of working with healers and meditators and psychics and these very gifted people. But there's something about the breadth and depth of the technology and the philosophy behind that technology, which is providing a great opportunity for people to try.
And welcome back to Coast, George Noory with Dr. Gary Schwartz and Jeffrey Stegman, as we are talking about focused life force energy, higher consciousness as well. It's truly remarkable. Jeffrey, let's bring you in here, too, as we're going to take calls with both of you this hour. This is remarkable research that you've all been doing. When you talk about focused life force energy, how do you focus? Where's that focus coming from?
Well, George, the original machine that I went to see with Clayton, as I said, it was like a Tesla machine. It had high-speed alternating current originally. The current machine does not have high-speed alternating current anymore, but basically all of that energy was being pulled from the ether or the environment, and it was focused in one spot on the machine. And that very high consciousness space is sort of the place of action of the FLFE system. And that's where, the instructions go that connect the FLFE system to a home or a cell phone. That address of the home or coordinates is the unique identifier that's in that high vibrating space, that high consciousness space that was this machine kind of pulled from the available energy. And like Gary was talking about, this consciousness pervading everything, this machine was able to pull and concentrate and focus that energy in one spot that creates the magic of the FLFE service.
It's pretty dramatic. Gary, have you witnessed anything more dramatic than this kind of system?
Not in terms of its breadth and depth. I mean, certainly there are phenomena that can be either very high energy, for example, causing huge sparks, or, there are all kinds of things that can be very, quote, powerful. But if you're talking about breadth and depth of overall effects on consciousness and on people's lives, I've never seen anything this, as I said, broad or deep. And the challenge of all that is that in order to do justice to both the inherent foundations, both conceptual and even spiritual, and also the consequences, one has to consider many different factors and approach them rigorously. So it's a big job, but it's nothing short of breathtaking in terms of its scope.
Do you find that children possess this ability as well?
The answer is some children, yes. But if you're talking about potential, I would say virtually all children, like all humans, have this capability to various degrees.
Remarkable. Let's take some calls for both of you. Let's start with Scott in Costa Mesa, California. Welcome. Hey, Scotty, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Yeah, George, I have a bone to pick with you. You sure do make it hard to go to sleep at night.
I know. I'm in the same bailiwick.
Your shows are great. And, I don't know who to direct my question.
All right. You ask a question, I'll direct it.
Yeah, tonight you're talking my language, but just last 6th of this month, I just lost my father.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and, I'm sad, but I'm at peace with it. But my brother, however, is not doing so good. And my question is there any way that I can give him some of my consciousness to him?
To get him to feel better, Dr. Schwartz, I'll give this to you.
That's a very interesting question, the way you framed it. There are many things that you could potentially do to help. This is your brother, did you say?
Yeah, the brother's upset, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I got the simply correct. There are various kinds of resources, both books and documentaries and YouTubes that address various aspects of the idea that consciousness is primary, that our consciousness continues like the light from distant stars long after the stars, quote, died, that energy can't be created or destroyed, it can only be transformed. There are many different factors that contribute to the being able to be both peaceful about a loss and also look forward to a future where one can be with a loved one again. That doesn't mean that one's pain or you don't grieve. I mean, there's no substitute for being with a person in the physical. But that doesn't mean that we have to live in agony forever over this. And the grieving process can be greatly facilitated with this increased knowledge.
Gary, is there a normal length of grieving period that you would consider to be, that's expected?
Again, that's also a great question. People vary in the length with which they grieve, and also depending upon the level of the relationship they have with someone and their closeness. I think one of the things that has most surprised me is that I've had the privilege to work with very gifted mediums. Now, these are people who are evidential mediums. They're the real deal. They're not frauds or cold readers. They've passed every test that us scientists have sort of put them through. And although they absolutely know that life after death continues, that you can maintain a relationship with your loved ones even after they're physically gone and so on, if their mother dies or if their child dies, they experience deep pain and grief. So that grief can go on for some time. It can be years. So on the one hand, you'd like to be able to short circuit the pain and reduce suffering, and on the other hand, there's the element of quote making peace with the process.
That's a good point. And let me go back to Scott in a moment. Scott, how old was your father when he passed?
You know, he had a wonderful, long 95 and a half years.
Oh, my gosh, that's a great run.
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting because also you're talking about sort of consciousness and the wonder of life, and I have that in spades, and my brother is more very blunt and sometimes brings me down kind of thing. And I'm kind of wishy-washy because I see a lot of both sides of things. And so there's like a bone of contention because I could push his buttons pretty easily.
Brother's a little more negative, isn't he?
Yeah. I love him to death. You know,
of course.
Yeah.
I get that. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate you being part of the program. Next up, let's go to Carl in Boston. Hey, Carl, welcome to the show.
Hi, George. Thank you for taking my call. It seems
Thank
like
you,
it's been
Carl.
forever I talked to you, but you definitely have the best show. And Gina, wow, she's a great screener. Anyway, I had a quote from Ramtha and a comment about consciousness. The quote says, "Quantum physics tells us that nothing that is observed is unaffected by the observer." That statement from science holds an enormous and powerful insight. It means that everyone sees a different truth because everyone is creating what they see. And my comment about consciousness is I believe this goes for either of you. I believe it goes for Jeffrey, but with consciousness, it is the spirit of the divine. It is what lies in with all of us, and that's all I got. Thank you, George.
All right, Jeffrey, you want to comment on some of that?
Yeah, thank you. The spirit of divine it's a beautiful way to say it. And I see that and have experienced it in even some of our research meetings, Gary, where as we rise in consciousness, maybe we're with a group of people and we're either on a mission together or in a path, or we're just meditating or praying together, there's some thinning of the veil and this connection to all that is, the oneness experience you were talking about, Gary. But there's in those moments, it seems that everything is connected and it's all divine in all ways, that we get those glimpses, and it seems that veil is there maybe for us to learn and strive towards those glimpses, but I feel really fortunate to have had those. Have you had those experiences? Something like that?
I have had many of them like that, but it is remarkable that you're able to channel this energy in order to accomplish these goals. I mean, it's really fascinating. And Gary, is science doing much about this?
That is also a very deep question, because there's probably nothing more controversial in science than the idea that there really is some kind of spirit of the divine, some sort of infinite and universal intelligence and consciousness, and that we are part of it, everything is part of it, that we can and are in relationship with it, and we can develop the capability to various degrees to communicate with it, and be involved in what many people refer to as, quote, co-creation with the divine. In fact, when I wrote the book, the GOD experiments, where GOD stands for Guiding, Organizing, and Designing Process, the subtitle that came to me was How Science is Discovering God in Everything, Including Us. So the idea that we can do all of this, which, by the way, is predicted by contemporary science, and especially system science, it is maybe the most taboo subject to address. And I'm actually working with a colleague in New York to attempt to bring the divine back into science. In fact, we're working toward creating a new interdisciplinary field, which has a lot of syllables, because you have to combine a lot of components. We called it theo-psycho-biophysics, which is the notion of bridging the divine with the human mind, with biology, and with fundamental physics. And when you bridge those four areas together and you use the tools that apply to those four, it becomes possible to address some of these questions within a scientific framework. Also, I might mention that at Santa Clara University, I don't have the exact date right now in front of me, maybe May 19th or 18th. You can go to the university website. We're actually holding a conference called Faith Seeking Understanding, where various scientists and various theologians from different perspectives are coming together to address the question of human relationships with the divine, the sacred, and the departed.
Does higher consciousness make you a better believer in a divine?
A better believer? Would you explain what you mean by that?
Someone who's on the fence would, for example, as opposed to somebody who is jumping in feet first going, I believe in God. I believe in this.
I would love Jeff to be able to address that question, particularly from his experience with FLFE.
Yeah, I think what I've experienced in these high consciousness fields, George, is just the infinite knowledge. It's like any question has an answer. It's like the no problem zone of all no problem zones, where when we're in these fields and we're trying to solve a problem, the information just comes through us. And that connection to the infinite intelligence, I mean, we developed FLFE in these kind of fields, George. We couldn't have done it ourselves without this help that comes through. And that, to me, that is just, divine showing up in just absolutely concrete form, because these answers to very thorny questions just show up. And we couldn't have thought of them. They just show up.
Not many researchers, practitioners, investigators like you and Gary are believers in that, and that I find that admirable.
But yet, throughout history, scientists have had the answers come to them, while they're sleeping, in the shower, and they just say, well, the answer just came to me. Well, where did it come from?
Exactly. Next up, let's go to Cheryl in Washburn, Missouri. Hello, Cheryl. Go ahead.
Hey, George, and Jeffrey, and Gary, and thanks, Gina, for the call. And thank you, too, George, for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm wondering, would either of you have any advice as to maintaining, like, this, the awareness in a small, solidified town where some may think that you're crazy for belonging beyond the hardcore practical approaches to existence? I heard you both, and I think you're amazing, and thank you so much, and I'll listen for your answer.
Don't worry what other people think about you, Cheryl. Just do your thing. I mean, how do people react to this, Gary?
Well, it depends who they are. As you know, particularly in a small town, I really sympathize and empathize with your caller, because you can feel alone, very alone, particularly when there are individuals around you who don't believe this, be they because they're skeptical as in disbelievers in the divinity, or they're skeptical because they've got very strong core religious beliefs which lead them to the conclusion that they can't connect with the divine, or that it's dangerous or it's immoral to attempt to connect with an angelic realm, and so on. I know that Jeff and FLFE have some experience with this, and I sometimes wonder whether or not the FLFE service can make it easier for people to continue on the path and make it easier to cope with individuals who are less inclined to be kind to those who are doing this kind of searching. By the way, I have to comment that I find it curious indeed, incidental and maybe not, that the next section of your show tonight involves you interviewing Dean Donald Walsh.
Conversations with God. Hold on for a second, Gary. We'll be back with more. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory back with Dr. Gary Schwartz and Jeffrey Stegman. Their websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Gary, how many books do you have out now?
Oh, if you're talking about books for the general public, I think there's maybe 14 now.
Good for you. Good for you. You've been at this for a while, and you just do a remarkable job. This world needs people like you and Jeffrey to do what you do.
Well, we enjoy the privilege of being individuals who are attempting to contribute to the process. You know, it's interesting that you bring up, for example, these books, because a coincidence. By the way, I meant Neil Donald Walsh, and I should explain that a synchronicity that connects us is that his original publisher was a publisher called Hampton Roads Press. And I'm not sure whether you remember those days, which was the Art Bell days.
Yep.
They did publishing in this area. And they also were the publisher of The Living Energy Universe, which was my first book for the general public and my first connection with Art Bell. So it's a long history. But I have to confess that that for individuals who are interested in these kinds of questions, another advantage of my experience of customers who become involved with FLFE is that they end up joining a community of individuals who care about these kinds of higher issues and higher values and higher goals. And so although they may have difficulty expressing these within their own families, for example, or others who may be skeptical. There's a place where they have the freedom to explore these things, and it's not science versus spirituality or science versus consciousness. It's really the joining of the two.
Good point. Good point. Let's go to the phones again. Let's go to Billy in Louisville, Kentucky. And Billy, our condolences for the tragedy out there today. My God. But go ahead, sir.
Yes, so George, first of all, thank you for taking my call. I'm a huge fan of yours, and thank you for your service. I'm a Navy veteran as well.
Oh, thank you.
I'm with a heavy heart today in Louisville.
What a tragedy. I guess he worked at the bank, or he just went out. He flipped out.
It seems that way. Everything is, I guess, to be determined. It hits hard with the governor and the mayor that it's so close that it's a tight-knit family here, and my heart goes out to all that, and I just want to say that to anyone listening in Louisville. George, I'm calling today because I lost my parents. Today's the 5-year anniversary. They died today, 67 minutes apart.
Oh my God!
Wow! And they were my best friends.
Did the second one? Billy, die of a broken heart?
They both had cancer. They were both in the same nursing home and room, My mother passed away first of brain cancer, and once she passed, in the same room, 67 minutes later, my dad passed. He had pancreatic cancer. We were able to get them into the same nursing home, which was a blessing to me and
Absolutely.
them as
They
well.
were, at least they were together.
They had just celebrated their 48th anniversary.
Wow.
And they were my best friends, and that was the toughest day of my life for me. And I know I'm on a certain time limit here, but I guess my question is since then, you know, I'm a veteran of the war. I've seen a lot of things, but I just want to ask that I've never seen my parents die on the same day like that, and it was very difficult. And I meditate now much more, and to try to connect. Is it possible that when I meditate and I do this and I pray and everything, do they feel my energy? Do I feel their energy, or is this just something that are they in a better place, not even worried about that, I guess?
All right, Gary, you're an expert in the afterlife. Go ahead. Answer Billy's question if you can.
Yeah, I could answer as well on that, too.
Okay, Jeff.
Sure. Jeff, why don't you go first?
Yeah, Billy, I feel, well, I know now because my son died a year ago, and he was 30, and I just was very blessed to have that connection through Clayton and other intuitives to talk to him after his passing. And he's expressed that whenever someone calls for him, he's there. Whenever someone thinks of him and calls out his name or meditates on him, he's there instantly. And in fact, he told us, this is after his passing, he told us that he took a course on the other side about grief so that he could understand grief better, because people are always calling him and he always has to go there. And sometimes they're angry, sometimes they're upset, sometimes, you know, grief can go through so many stages. But I believe with all my heart, Billy, that they are there when you reach out for them.
How about you, Gary?
Yes, I fully agree with Jeff's experience and his interpretation. There is so much evidence that indicates that people can have after-death communication and after-death relationships with their loved ones, even though they have no prior mediumship experience. They may have had even no beliefs in this possibility, and yet this is clearly possible. And the way that I express it, which sounds actually very similar to Jeff's, is I use a song that James Taylor made popular, which is that winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you need to do is call, and I'll be there. Yes, I will. You've got a friend. When you love someone and they love you, and then you're always going to be there if your loved one needs you or wants you. I mean, it's part of the essence of love, and it's quote automatic. You sort of can't help yourself, but you will be drawn to an individual that you love when they call you, and the so many gifted mediums that I've had the privilege to work with will not only report these things, but you can do scientific evidence to validate these claims. So I would strongly encourage your caller that if he's open to this, if he loves his parents and his parents love him, then it's part of the joy for both of you to be able to sustain that love.
Absolutely. And is it conceivable, Gary, that the father decided to go right after the mother to be with her?
Absolutely. It is very common, especially for people who have had a long, loving relationship and a family that really matters. They that if you would, each one stays around for the other, and they want to be together. So it's there are many cases of this happening.
Next up, let's go to Jerry in rural Iowa. Welcome to the show. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. I just watched a movie in the theaters across the U.S. still, called Jesus Revolution.
Oh, that's right. With Kelsey Grammer, right?
Yes, and I watched it 5 times. So with people in churches and stuff. So it's really on my mind a lot. And the topic that you guys have been talking about, like in the last hour, you're talking about the definition of higher consciousness. And I got a 3x5 card out, and I wrote down what you guys said, and I'm going to try to quote you, paraphrase, I hope. To integrate and extend one's awareness to create a higher good. And I have a Nam Jarhead, close friend of mine who has gone before fairly recently, and he really helps me understand 2 really important concepts. His name is Paul Moore. And he said, God is one and God is good. So I was wondering if you gentlemen could expand on the definition of good.
Shall we give that to you first, Gary?
Yes, I think your caller may be surprised to hear this, especially since he commented about this new Kelsey Grammer film, which I didn't know about, and now I'm very eager to see.
Oh, you'd love it. You'd love it.
Well, I want you, George, and your caller, everyone, to imagine that you take the word God, G-O-D, and have those letters be in a horizontal, and then in the vertical, put the letters G-O-O-D, so they make a cross. And then in the middle, where the O's join, the God and the good, you draw in an abstract image of a heart.
I like that.
And that image, I happened to recently put up on my computer to remind me to stay connected to the idea of the fundamental connection between God and goodness. So I'm literally looking at that right now. And so when your caller, mentions this, the question of goodness is so profound, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone in any show really ask the deep question, what is goodness? And I'm going to pass the baton to Jeffrey, because one of the things that Jeff often says is that when he shares his invocations or his prayers, he will often say, for the best and highest good for all of creation. It's not just best and highest good, but best and highest good for all of creation. So Jeff, do you want to share with us what you mean by good?
Yeah, what I mean by good is it's good. It's like good to the infinite power, right? It's a win-win infinitely. That when we get into these, deep prayers, invocation, high consciousness space, and these solutions appear, like we've been talking about, they're always a win-win-win-win. Just everybody wins. And there's just that to me, that is the good. That's how we're defining good, is that everyone wins, everyone grows, everyone evolves in their consciousness closer to God. I mean, that's what consciousness, to me, being in a high conscious field, or however you work to meditate or pray to raise your consciousness, it's moving closer to divinity, closer to the source, and in that source, it's a multiple win for everyone.
Jeffrey, for people who want more information on your work, where can they find you? FLFE.net is our website, and there is the free trial, as Gary mentioned before. There's no credit card.
it's a great place to experiment, to try it out, to see what it's like for yourself. And it's just a gift from us. We knew in a 2-week free trial that people would really benefit, and that's all we really want. And during the free trial, you have access to lots of material, lots of webinars, lots of interesting things. And we also have a podcast called Fields of Consciousness that's out there in all the platforms.
You've done some research in the grain and things like that with consciousness, and it grows faster, doesn't it?
Yeah, we saw a 22% increase in yield.
That's amazing.
In a big commercial farm with John Deere tractors measuring the yield per acre. And that was in a semi-drought. We think we can do even better this year.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's a consciousness field on a farm field.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you. And Gary, thank you for being on the program. Do keep in touch with us.
Yeah, thank you, George. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Gary Schwartz as well. Fantastic people.